There are passages in the Bible that challenge our conventional understanding, opening doors to interpretations that move between the theological and the mystical. Among them, perhaps none is as enigmatic as the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6, where it is mentioned that the sons of God took the daughters of men to themselves as wives, begetting an offspring of renowned heroes and men of great stature. This brief, almost cryptic narrative has been the subject of intense theological debate for millennia, with ramifications stretching from understanding angelic nature to prophecies about the end times. What really happened in that pre-Diluvian period that was so significant as to be recorded in the Holy Scriptures? What if this is not just a historical curiosity, but a prophetic warning about events that could be repeated in humanity's last days? The passage that intrigues us is found at the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. The text is surprisingly brief for the depth of the mystery it contains. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves from all whom they chose. In those days the giants were on the earth, and also afterwards, when the sons of God met the daughters of men, and they bore them sons. These were mighty men, men of renown in ancient times. These few lines, apparently simple, have opened up an abyss of questions that have challenged scholars, theologians, and mystics for millennia. The context of this narrative is crucial to its understanding. Set just before the account of the flood, it seems to provide one of the fundamental reasons for God's decision to cleanse the earth. Is it just a coincidence that after mentioning this strange union, the text immediately tells us that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man had multiplied on the earth? The chronology suggests a causal relationship between these supernatural events and the widespread corruption that provoked divine judgment. The expression "sons of God," in Hebrew Bnei Ha-Elohim, appears in other passages of the Old Testament, notably in Job, where it clearly refers to angelic beings who stand before the divine throne. This linguistic consistency led many ancient scholars to conclude that Genesis was, in fact, describing angelic interference in the human lineage. But how would it be possible for spiritual beings to unite physically with human women? Aren't angels, by nature, incapable of such carnal materialization? The oldest manuscripts we have offer little additional clarity. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament made in the 3rd century BC, uses the term angeloi tou theou, angels of God, suggesting that the Jewish translators of that time understood the passage as referring to angelic beings. The Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the Book of Enoch, develop this narrative extensively, describing in detail how 200 watchers, angels, descended on Mount Hermon, took human form and taught women forbidden arts, from metallurgy and cosmetics to sorcery and astrology. This angelic interpretation predominated in the first centuries of Judaism and Christianity. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian of the 1st century, wrote that many angels of God have united with women and begotten unrighteous children. Philon of Alexandria, an important Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, shared a similar view. Among the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Lactantius all defended the idea that fallen angelic beings had materialized to corrupt the human lineage. Have you ever wondered why this interpretation, so widely accepted in antiquity, was later relegated almost to the status of heresy? The change in interpretation began mainly with Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Uncomfortable with the theological implications of angels procreating with humans, he proposed an alternative reading. The sons of God would be the virtuous descendants of Seth, Adam and Eve's 3rd son, while the daughters of men would be the descendants of Cain's corrupted line. This interpretation, known as the Sethite theory, gained strength in the medieval West, becoming practically the orthodox view in later Christian theology, especially after being adopted by Thomas Aquinas and other important theologians. But does the original text really support this more convenient interpretation? Note that the immediate context makes no mention of Seth or his lineage. Furthermore, why would the result of this union produce giants or Nephilim, from the Hebrew naphal, to fall, beings described as men of renown? If it were simply a union between two human lineages, one pious and the other ungodly, we would only expect the birth of ordinary people, perhaps morally compromised, but certainly not extraordinary beings physically or endowed with incomparable fame. Cultures around the world have surprisingly similar narratives. In Greek mythology, there are tales of gods who come down to have relationships with mortal women, giving rise to famous demigods like Hercules and Perseus. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes its protagonist as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. In India, the Vedas speak of the Asuras who had relationships with humans. Were all these stories distorted echoes of a real event that took place at the dawn of humanity? Or did the biblical authors merely incorporate mythological elements common to neighboring cultures? The word Nephilim, translated as giants in many versions, is another crucial element of this narrative. It derives from a Hebrew root that suggests the fallen, or those who make others fall. Some modern scholars argue that the term may refer not necessarily to physical stature, but to the moral status of these beings, tyrants who have fallen over others in oppression. However, later descriptions in the Bible, such as in Numbers chapter 13 verse 33, where the Hebrew spies report seeing Nephilim in the land of Canaan, before whom we were like grasshoppers, strongly suggest a literal interpretation of extraordinary stature. It is significant that the biblical text mentions that these Nephilim existed in those days, and also afterwards, a mysterious indication that such beings were not completely eliminated by the flood. How could this be, considering that only Noah and his family survived? This apparent contradiction has led some scholars to propose that the phenomenon of sons of God taking over daughters of men was not a one-off event, but something that occurred repeatedly in human history. What if this supernatural infiltration of the human genome was not just a story from the distant past, but a pattern that could be repeated, or is already underway, in our own day? Among the various interpretations of the enigma of the sons of God, none is as fascinating and controversial as the theory of the fallen angels. This view, prevalent in the first centuries of both Judaism and early Christianity, holds that angelic beings, endowed with free will, rebelled against the cosmic order established by God and crossed the boundary between the spiritual and the material. But who were these angels? According to the ancient texts, particularly the Book of Enoch, they were the so-called Watchers, in Aramaic, Iron, heavenly beings originally appointed to observe humanity, not to interfere in its development. The Book of Enoch, although not part of the biblical canon in most modern Christian and Jewish traditions, was widely respected in ancient times and is even quoted in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament. This text elaborates extensively on the narrative of the fallen angels, providing names, numbers, and surprising details. According to Enoch, 200 angels, led by Semjaza and Azazel, made a pact with each other on Mount Hermon, vowing to carry out their plan to take human form and unite with the women of the earth. Have you ever wondered why a text with such specific details and quoted by a New Testament author ended up being excluded from the official canon? What makes the Enoch narrative particularly intriguing is its explanation of the transfer of forbidden knowledge. These angels not only generated hybrid offspring, but also taught humanity arts and sciences that were apparently not meant to be revealed at that stage of human development. Azazel is said to have taught the making of swords, shields, and armor, as well as the metallurgy of silver and gold. Semjaza revealed incantations and the cutting of roots. Armoros taught how to break spells, Barakegel, astrology, Kokabel, the signs, Tamiel, astronomy, and Asradal, the movements of the moon. This premature technological and esoteric transfer would have unbalanced the natural development of civilization, accelerating its corruption. The result of this angelic intervention was the birth of the Nephilim, described as beings of extraordinary stature and strength. Enoch says that they consumed all the fruit of men's labor until it became impossible to feed them, and then they turned against men to devour them. In other words, these hybrids were not the same as the Nephilim. In other words, these hybrids not only physically dominated humanity, but eventually became cannibals, leading to a spiral of violence that corrupted the entire earth. It's interesting to note that myths about cannibal giants appear in practically every ancient culture, from the Greek Cyclops to the Norse Jotuns and the Hindu Rakshasa. But how could spiritual beings take on physical form and procreate with humans? This is undoubtedly the most difficult aspect of the fallen angel theory. Some rabbinic traditions suggest that angels possess the ability to materialize, pointing to the angelic visits recorded throughout the Bible, such as when 3 angels visited Abraham and ate a meal. The New Testament also states in Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2 that some entertained angels without knowing it, implying that these beings can present themselves in a form indistinguishable from human. As for reproductive capacity, some theologians argue that, on leaving their heavenly position, these angels would have acquired or developed physical capacities similar to those of humans. The strongest textual argument against this interpretation comes from the words of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 22 verse 30, where he states that, "In the resurrection neither will men marry nor will women be given in marriage, but they will be like the angels in heaven." However, note carefully the specificity of the words, "angels in heaven." This qualification could imply that Jesus was referring only to the angels who retained their heavenly position, not to those who left their own abode, as described by Jude. Furthermore, the context of Jesus' statement deals with the condition of the resurrected, not necessarily the intrinsic nature of angels. A careful reading of other biblical passages reveals surprising connections with this narrative. In 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 to 5, we read that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, into abysses of darkness, reserving them for judgment, explicitly connecting this angelic imprisonment with Noah's generation and the flood. Jude verses 6 to 7 are even more specific, mentioning angels who did not keep their original state, but abandoned their own dwelling, and drawing a parallel between their sin and that of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities condemned for sexual perversion. This parallel strongly suggests that the sin of these angels was sexual in nature, corroborating the angelic interpretation of Genesis chapter 6. Archaeological evidence from various parts of the world seems to provide indirect support for reports of beings of gigantic stature. Since the 1800s, there have been records of discoveries of human skeletons of extraordinary proportions, although many of these reports come from sources of questionable credibility. More concrete are the megalithic structures found on every continent, from the Egyptian pyramids to the platforms of Baalbek in Lebanon and the monuments of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, which seem to defy the technological capacity of the civilizations that officially built them. Could this be physical evidence of the advanced knowledge transmitted by the Watchers, as described in the ancient texts? The theory of fallen angels doesn't just explain an obscure episode in biblical prehistory. It establishes a paradigm of supernatural intervention in human history that has profound theological implications. If we accept that angelic beings once interfered in the genetic and cultural development of humanity, it opens up the possibility that such interference may have occurred at other times, or even that it continues to occur. This perspective offers an alternative framework for mysterious phenomena throughout human history, from reports of ancient gods, who brought civilization to different peoples, to modern reports of encounters with non-human entities. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this theory is the suggestion that some of the Nephilim's DNA may have survived the flood. Although most scholars who accept the angelic interpretation assume that the Nephilim were completely wiped out by the global flood, the biblical text itself enigmatically states that they existed in those days and also afterwards. Later, during the conquest of Canaan, the Israelites encountered peoples described as descendants of the Nephilim, such as Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 9 cubits long, approximately 4 meters. How can this persistence be explained? Could it be that some of these beings survived the flood? Or was there a second incursion of fallen angels after the time of Noah? What if these modified genetic lineages are still among us, unnoticeable except for occasional manifestations of unusual abilities? If the angelic interpretation seems too fantastic or theologically problematic, a more conventional alternative gained predominance in later Jewish and Christian traditions, the so-called Sethite theory. This interpretation, which began to gain strength mainly from the 5th century onwards with Augustine of Hippo, proposes that the sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 were simply the descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, born after the murder of Abel. According to this view, the lineage of Seth would have maintained the worship of the true God and a pious lifestyle, in contrast to the lineage of Cain, who turned away from God and developed a materialistic and corrupt civilization. The textual basis for this interpretation is found in passages such as Genesis chapter 4 verse 26, where it says that in the days of Enos, son of Seth, they began to call on the name of the Lord. Advocates of the Sethite theory understand this passage as an indication that Seth's lineage developed a tradition of genuine worship, thus becoming God's representatives on earth. Hence they are called sons of God. In contrast, the genealogy of Cain presented in Genesis chapter 4 describes the development of cities, arts, and crafts, but without mentioning any connection to God, suggesting a lineage that prospers materially while straying spiritually. Medieval rabbis such as Rashi, 1040 to 1105, and Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, favored this interpretation, partly to avoid the theological complications of the angelic vision. In the Christian tradition, in addition to Augustine, influential theologians such as John Chrysostom Cyril of Alexandria, and later Thomas Aquinas consolidated the Sethite theory as the orthodox explanation for the passage. The Protestant Reformation, despite questioning many aspects of medieval theology, generally maintained this interpretation, with figures such as John Calvin vigorously defending the Sethite view against what he considered fanciful speculations about procreative angels. An important argument in favor of this interpretation is its coherence with the biblical theme of the two lineages that develop after the fall, one that seeks God and the other that rebels against him. This duality appears repeatedly in the biblical narratives: Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and even in the Pauline metaphor of the flesh versus the spirit. From this perspective, the story of Genesis chapter 6 simply represents a critical moment in which the separation between these two lineages, fundamental to the divine plan, was compromised by marital interaction. Can you imagine the devastating impact this mixture would have on the divine plan to preserve a sanctified lineage through which the Messiah would eventually come? Proponents of the Sethite theory also offer alternative explanations for the more mysterious elements of the narrative. The Nephilim, rather than supernatural hybrids, were simply men of exceptional stature and strength, perhaps tyrants who oppressed others, not so different from the heroes of ancient mythologies, who were often described as oppressors. The Hebrew word naphal, fall, could refer to their moral fall or the way they fell on others in violence. As for the description of being men of renown, this could simply indicate their notoriety as warriors or leaders, not necessarily a supernatural origin. An aspect often overlooked in the discussion is the role of the daughters of men in this narrative. In the Sethite interpretation, these would be the descendants of Cain, described as beautiful, suggesting that pious men were attracted by superficial qualities rather than spiritual virtue. This reading turns the passage into a warning against marriages motivated only by physical attraction, especially when they involve partners who don't share spiritual values. Many preachers over the centuries have used this interpretation to draw moral lessons about the importance of choosing partners within the same faith and equal yoke, as Paul would later advise. The main weakness of the Sethite theory, however, is explaining why this mixture between human lineages would produce beings so extraordinary as to be highlighted in the sacred text. If the sons of God and the daughters of men were all equally human, differing only in their spiritual orientation, why would their offspring be physically or characterologically distinct? Furthermore, the term sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, is never used elsewhere in the Old Testament to refer to pious humans, but appears in passages such as Job chapter 1 verse 6 and chapter 38 verse 7, clearly designating angelic beings. Would it be reasonable to assume that the same term would have a completely different meaning in Genesis chapter 6? Another significant objection comes from biblical chronology. If we carefully examine the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, we notice that Adam was still alive when Lamech, Noah's father, was born, and Noah was born only 14 years after Adam's death. In other words, the separation between the lineages of Seth and Cain was not yet so pronounced as to turn them into genetically or culturally distinct groups. Even more problematic, Seth was not the only son of Adam and Eve besides Cain. Genesis chapter 5 verse 4 mentions that Adam begot sons and daughters, in addition to those named. How then can we distinguish who belonged to the godly lineage and who belonged to the worldly lineage just a few generations later? Despite these difficulties, the Sethite interpretation predominated in formal theology for most of Christian and Jewish history because it offered an explanation that was more compatible with certain established doctrines about angelic nature. However, in recent decades, with the growing interest in pseudepigraphal texts such as Enoch and the recognition of the importance of these texts for Second Temple Judaism, many scholars have reconsidered the angelic interpretation. Even conservative theologians like Michael Heiser, John Walton, and Derek Kidner have argued that, based purely on textual analysis and historical context, the angelic interpretation seems more faithful to the original intention of the author of Genesis. Regardless of the interpretation adopted, the episode of the sons of God and daughters of men establishes a crucial theological principle: holiness requires separation. Whether literally or metaphorically, the narrative illustrates how mixing what should remain distinct leads to corruption and divine judgment. This lesson would resonate throughout Israel's history, with the repeated warnings against intermarriage with pagan peoples, not for reasons of racial purity, but to preserve religious fidelity. And wouldn't this same concern be reflected in the New Testament's warnings against being unequally yoked with unbelievers? Perhaps the value of this enigmatic passage lies less in its literal interpretation and more in the spiritual principle it illustrates about the need to maintain clear boundaries between the sacred and the profane. There is a profound reason why the enigmatic passage in Genesis chapter 6 continues to fascinate scholars and lay people alike. Its possible connection with the prophecies about the last days. Jesus Christ, when speaking about his second coming, made an intriguing statement recorded in Matthew chapter 24 verse 37. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. This explicit reference draws a parallel between pre-Diluvian conditions and the state of the world just before Christ's return. But what exactly was Jesus comparing? Most interpreters focus on the subsequent mention of people eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, suggesting a normal life carried on in ignorance of the impending divine judgment. But what if there is a deeper meaning in this comparison? If we accept that something extraordinary and supernatural occurred in the days of Noah, whether angelic infiltration into the human bloodline or another form of unprecedented corruption, Jesus' statement takes on more disturbing dimensions. It suggests that something similar could happen again before his return. This perspective is reinforced by the mysterious statement in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 that the Nephilim existed in those days, and also afterward. The prophet Daniel, describing the final kingdom that would precede the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, enigmatically says that it would be partly strong and partly weak. They shall mingle with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another. Daniel chapter 2 verses 42 to 43. Could this be an allusion to another attempt to mix human and non-human in the last days? The book of Revelation presents images that some scholars interpret as possible references to a recurrence of the Nephilim phenomenon. In chapter 9, John describes demonic creatures being released from the abyss, the same place where, according to the Enochian tradition, the fallen angels were imprisoned. These creatures are described as having an appearance like horses prepared for war, with faces like human faces, and hair like women's hair. A description that suggests hybrid beings, neither completely human nor completely animal. More significantly, they are led by a king called Abaddon in Hebrew or Apollyon in Greek, names that mean destroyer, reminiscent of the powerful destroyers that were the original Nephilim. The figure of the Antichrist, central to Christian eschatology, presents characteristics that can be interpreted as parallel to those of the Nephilim. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 9, Paul describes the man of lawlessness as coming according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders. Revelation chapter 13 verse 2 states that the dragon, identified as Satan, gives the Antichrist his power, his throne and great authority. In both descriptions, we see a human being endowed with supernatural abilities through direct demonic intervention. Isn't this a parallel with the Nephilim, who also resulted from the intervention of fallen spirit beings in the human realm? Have you considered the possibility that the Antichrist is not merely a wicked human, but something fundamentally different? Perhaps the culmination of a process of corruption that began in the days before the flood? In more speculative theological circles, some propose that just as the first coming of Christ involved the supernatural birth of the Son of God in human flesh through virginal conception, the final manifestation of evil could involve a perversion of this mystery, a human being conceived or genetically modified through demonic interference. Although such speculation goes beyond what the scriptures explicitly state, it finds some support in the language of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, where God promises enmity between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent. If Christ is the supreme offspring of the woman, could the Antichrist represent, in some sense, the offspring of the serpent? Another text often cited in this context is Daniel chapter 2 verse 43, which, in describing the final empire represented by the feet of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, states, "As for what you saw of iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle with the offspring of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, as iron does not mingle with clay." The identity of this "they" who will mix with human seed is not specified, leading some interpreters to suggest a connection with the supernatural mixture of Genesis chapter 6. The Aramaic text is particularly intriguing, as it uses the phrase Zerah Anashah, seed of men, in a similar way to the expression daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6, implying a contrast between human and non-human entities. Modern technology introduces an additional dimension to this discussion. For the first time in human history, we have the tools to directly manipulate the genetic code, create hybrid beings, and potentially alter what it means to be human. From cloning to gene editing with CRISPR, from artificial intelligence to the brain-machine interface, we are rapidly developing capabilities that blur the lines between the natural and the artificial, the human and the non-human. Some contemporary theologians wonder if such technological developments could facilitate a modern recurrence of the Nephilim phenomenon, not through the physical materialization of angels, but through technological manipulation guided by demonic influence. Wouldn't this be a contemporary manifestation of the same impulse to rebel against the limits set by God that motivated the original Watchers? The contemporary phenomenon of reports of encounters with non-human entities, from extraterrestrial visitors to channeled spirit guides, has also been interpreted by some Christian researchers as possible modern manifestations of the same beings described as sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. Theologians such as Chuck Missler and Michael Heiser note that these entities, despite presenting themselves as beneficial, often promote views incompatible with Orthodox Christianity, particularly denying the divinity of Christ and the need for redemption through his sacrifice. Could it be a coincidence that these entities seem to share the same agenda of spiritual subversion attributed to the fallen angels in ancient texts? Most conservative theologians warn against excessive speculation in this area, emphasizing that the main focus of biblical eschatology is not on identifying specific physical manifestations of evil, but on remaining vigilant and faithful regardless of the form that opposition to God may take. Paul warns in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14 that Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light, suggesting that the deception of the last days will be subtle and attractive, not obviously monstrous. This warning is particularly relevant in an age when promises of spiritual evolution and human enhancement through technology are presented as paths to a better future. After all, wasn't it this very promise, "You will be like gods," that constituted the original temptation in the Garden of Eden? Regardless of how we interpret the details, the connection between Genesis chapter 6 and the prophecies of the end times reminds us of a fundamental principle. The spiritual battle raging through human history is not merely about ideas or political systems, but about the very definition of what it means to be human, created in the image of God. If pre-Diluvian corruption involved an attempt to distort this image through supernatural interference, we must be vigilant against similar efforts in our day, whether manifested through technology, ideology, or false spirituality. As Jesus warned when speaking of the last days, "For there will arise false Christs and false prophets, and they will perform such great signs and wonders that, if it were possible, they will deceive even the elect." Matthew chapter 24 verse 24. The enigmatic narrative of the sons of God and their descendants has not remained confined to the pages of sacred scripture, but reverberates through countless cultures, traditions, and artistic expressions throughout human history. This universality is fascinating in itself. Practically all ancient civilizations preserved legends about divine or semi-divine beings who interacted with humans, often producing exceptional heroes or fearsome monsters. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were described as deities who created humans and occasionally interacted with them. In Greece, the Olympian gods regularly came down to have relationships with mortals, generating demigods like Hercules and Perseus. In Norse mythology, the Vanir and the Aesir interacted with humans and giants. In ancient China, accounts speak of children of heaven who brought civilization. Is it mere coincidence that cultures separated by vast oceans and mountains developed such similarly structured narratives? Or were they all preserving, in culturally filtered forms, memories of real events from human prehistory? Even in the Americas, isolated from the Old World for millennia, we find surprising parallels. The Aztecs spoke of the Quinametsin, a race of giants who inhabited the world in a previous era. The Incas had legends about the Viracochas, pale, tall beings who emerged from Lake Titicaca to teach human civilization. Several North American Indian tribes preserved oral traditions about giants who were destroyed in a great flood. The Hawaiians told stories about the Menehune, a people of small stature but supernatural strength who built impressive structures. What would explain this narrative convergence in cultures that, according to conventional archaeological knowledge, had no significant contact until relatively recent times? Medieval literature and art preserved and elaborated these themes. The Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf features the monster Grendel, described as a descendant of Cain and part of a line of cursed giants. Arthurian romances often mention giants and hybrid beings inhabiting the pre-Christian landscape of Britain. In European folk traditions, accounts of fairies, elves, and other beings between worlds potentially represent distorted cultural memories of the Nephilim or their consequences. Even in Islamic narratives, we find the jinn beings created from fire without smoke, who can interact with humans and generate hybrid offspring. These traditions seem to preserve, in culturally adapted forms, memories of a time when the boundary between the human and the supernatural was more permeable. The revival of interest in texts like the Book of Enoch in the last 2 centuries has inspired fascinating literary explorations of this theme. John Milton, in Paradise Lost, alludes to the fallen angels and their influence on humanity. Lord Byron was influenced by these traditions in several of his works. In contemporary literature, authors such as C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien have incorporated elements of this cosmology into their fictional universes. Tolkien's Númenóreans, with their longevity and superior stature, echo the men of renown of antiquity. Stephen King, in The Dance of Death, explores themes of human corruption through supernatural interference reminiscent of Enochian narrative. Even in modern popular culture, from series like Supernatural and American Horror Story to video games like the Diablo series, the themes of hybridization between humans and angels/demons continue to fascinate the popular imagination. In addition to cultural expressions, there is intriguing archaeological evidence that some researchers connect to the Nephilim narrative. Human skeletons of unusual stature have been discovered at various archaeological sites, although rarely as gigantic as some internet sensationalists suggest. In 1800, ethnologist Georges Vacher de la Puge reported finding human bones in a Romano-Gaulish cemetery in Castelnau, France, that suggested a height of 3.5 meters. The tombs of Catalina, discovered in the Philippines in 1906, contained skeletons measuring between 3 and 3 meters and 7/10. In Wisconsin, United States, numerous burial mounds have revealed human remains with estimated heights between 2 meters and 1/10 and 2 meters and 4/10, with disproportionately large cranial cases. While the conventional scientific community generally attributes such findings to medical conditions such as acromegaly or pituitary gigantism, some researchers question whether the frequency and distribution of these findings might suggest a genetically distinct lineage rather than mere anomalies. Even more intriguing are the ancient megastructures whose construction defies conventional explanations. The 1,200-ton blocks in the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, Lebanon, the perfectly fitted walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where blocks of up to 200 tons were positioned with millimeter precision, the immense monoliths of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, supposedly built by pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. All these structures raise questions about the technological capabilities of ancient civilizations. Could it be that some of these monumental achievements represent the traces of advanced knowledge passed on by the Watchers, as described in the Book of Enoch? Or perhaps they are the work of the Nephilim themselves, whose physical capabilities far exceeded those of normal humans. Such speculations remain controversial in academic circles, but illustrate how the biblical narrative continues to inform alternative interpretations of archaeological evidence. The discovery of apparently anachronistic artifacts, objects that seem to embody advanced knowledge or technologies for their time, has also been interpreted by some as possible evidence of the transfer of knowledge mentioned in the Enochian texts. The Baghdad Battery, a ceramic jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron bar dating from around 250 BC, apparently capable of generating electricity. The detailed Piri Reis maps showing precise coastal features of Antarctica supposedly before its discovery. The mysterious flexible substance found in ancient Hindu sculptures that seems to deform and return to its original shape. All these examples have been cited as possible evidence of advanced knowledge in antiquity. That does not fit easily into the conventional narrative of human technological development. Recent genetic analysis has introduced a new dimension to this debate. The discovery of Denisovan DNA in 2010, representing a previously unknown humanoid species that coexisted with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, has demonstrated that human evolutionary history is more complex than previously thought. More significantly, it was discovered that modern human populations carry between 1% and 6% Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, confirming that there has been genetic mixing between different humanoid lineages. Although these findings are perfectly explainable within the conventional evolutionary paradigm, some theorists propose alternative interpretations that connect these ancient genetic mixtures with the narratives about sons of God and daughters of men. The biblical expression, and also afterwards, when referring to the presence of the Nephilim could, according to this speculative view, allude to the persistence of distinct genetic lineages that occasionally manifest phenotypically in individuals with exceptional physical or mental characteristics. Contemporary scientific approaches to the Nephilim phenomenon vary enormously, from complete skepticism that considers such narratives purely mythological to speculative proposals that seek to reinterpret ancient history in the light of these traditions. Researcher Michael Heiser, for example, argues that understanding the worldview of the ancient world, including the belief in the reality of these hybrid beings, is essential to correctly interpreting the scriptures, even if we don't accept literally every element of these narratives. Others, such as L.A. Marzulli and Tom Horn, have extensively documented historical and contemporary accounts of anomalous beings, proposing connections with the biblical narrative. Regardless of the position adopted, academic interest in the myth of the fallen angels has grown significantly in recent decades, recognizing its importance for understanding the Jewish thought of the Second Temple period and the cultural context of the New Testament. Perhaps the most relevant aspect for our times is not to determine the historical literalness of the Nephilim narrative, but to recognize its power as a metaphor for the ongoing tension between the human and the transhuman. We live in an era in which genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, brain-machine interfaces, and other transformative technologies promise to improve the human condition. Transhumanists talk openly about overcoming human biological limitations to create a superior post-humanity. Are we not witnessing a contemporary manifestation of the same impulse that, according to ancient texts, motivated the children of God to cross established boundaries? Don't the promises of immortality, superhuman power, and transcendent knowledge offered by modern technology echo the original temptation? You will be like gods? Regardless of how we interpret the literal details of the ancient narrative, its warning about the dangers of seeking transcendence through illicit means remains deeply relevant. Beyond historical, archaeological, and eschatological speculation, the enigmatic narrative of the sons of God and their descendants offers profound spiritual lessons for contemporary believers. Regardless of how we interpret the specific details of Genesis chapter 6, the passage vividly illustrates the reality of the spiritual battle that pervades all of human history. At its core, the episode reveals a coordinated attempt to corrupt the human bloodline, whether literally through genetic interference or metaphorically through spiritual influence. This corruption had a clear purpose: to frustrate the divine plan of redemption which, as we know from Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, would come through the seed of the woman. If the Nephilim represented a contamination of the human lineage, wasn't this a direct strategy to prevent the birth of the future Redeemer? And if such a strategy was employed once, shouldn't we be alert to the possibility of similar attacks, in forms adapted to our time, against God's redemptive purpose today? One of the clearest lessons of this passage is the reality of spiritual infiltration. The sons of God, whether fallen angels or corrupted humans, represent entities that were supposed to serve divine purposes but instead subverted their original vocation. This subversion did not occur through frontal opposition, but through a subtle blending that blurred the boundaries established by God. The Apostle Paul warned, "Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light." 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14. The most dangerous deception rarely comes as a complete rejection of the truth, but as a subtle distortion, a near truth that retains enough elements of the genuine to appear plausible, while introducing fatal corruptions. How many times in Christian ministry have we seen movements that began with apparent piety, but gradually introduced elements alien to the faith, eventually producing a hybrid spirituality as far removed from original Christianity as the Nephilim were from genuine humanity? The question of spiritual authority emerges as another crucial theme of this text. The Watchers, as described in the book of Enoch, were beings who abandoned their own domicile, Jude verse 6, their designated position in the cosmic order, to assume functions and privileges that did not legitimately belong to them. It wasn't just the sexual act that constituted their transgression, but the fundamental violation of limits of authority established in divine creation. This principle resonates deeply in our age of radical autonomy and self-conferred authority. We live in a time when each individual considers themselves the final authority on their own truth, their own morality, their own identity, even their own gender and biological nature. Isn't this a contemporary manifestation of the same spirit of rebellion that motivated the children of God to overstep their designated boundaries? As Christians, we are called to a counterculture of submission, not to human tyranny, but to the divinely established order that reflects the wisdom of the Creator. The narrative also vividly illustrates the consequences of spiritual contamination. The biblical text suggests a progression. First, the forbidden union occurs, then the Nephilim are born, and finally, the earth was filled with violence. Genesis chapter 6 verse 11. This sequence reveals how spiritual corruption inevitably spills over into the social, cultural, and even physical realms. We cannot compartmentalize spirituality as an isolated dimension of existence. It inevitably shapes all other areas of life. This is why Paul warns against being unequally yoked together with unbelievers, 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 14, not out of spiritual elitism, but out of the realistic recognition that fundamentally incompatible worldviews, when mixed together, inevitably produce dysfunctional results. Have you ever observed how a small concession on spiritual principles often opens the door to larger compromises that eventually completely transform the character of a person, family, or institution? The divine response to pre-flood corruption, the judgment of the flood, reveals another crucial principle. God sets limits to moral deterioration. Although divine patience is vast, my spirit will not strive with man forever. Genesis chapter 6 verse 3. There is a point beyond which divine intervention becomes necessary. This principle operates both in collective history and in individual experience. As Romans chapter 1 verses 24 to 28 describes, there is a process in which God eventually delivers those who persistently reject the truth to the consequences of their choices. The flood was not an emotional reaction by an angry God, but a necessary surgical intervention to preserve the possibility of redemption for humanity. In the same way, the difficult times prophesied for the last days, 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 1 to 5, do not represent the failure of the divine plan, but its unfolding as anticipated, culminating not in the victory of the forces of darkness, but in the glorious return of Christ to establish his kingdom. While most discussions of the Nephilim focus on the identity of the sons of God, equal attention deserves to be paid to the daughters of men. If we consider the significance of women as a consistent symbol in the Bible, often representing belief systems, compare the woman in Revelation chapter 12 with the prostitute in Revelation chapter 17, the lesson becomes clear. When true faith, the sons of God in the Sethite interpretation, compromises with worldly systems, the daughters of men, the result is a hybrid and monstrous spirituality. This lesson is painfully relevant in our age of a la carte spirituality, where elements of Christianity are routinely mixed with practices from esoteric traditions, Eastern philosophies, and humanistic psychologies, producing a watered-down faith that retains Christian terminology while abandoning its unique essence. As C.S. Lewis warned, we don't want a God who is so small that he can fit inside our minds. We want a God who is so big that we can never escape him. The preservation of Noah, a preacher of righteousness, who walked with God in the midst of a completely corrupted generation, offers powerful encouragement for contemporary Christians living in societies increasingly hostile to biblical values. Noah's steadfast obedience, persisting in building the ark despite decades of mockery, exemplifies authentic faith, which is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 7. Significantly, Noah not only built a physical refuge, but also, according to 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5, served as a preacher of righteousness to his generation. His life thus balanced separation from the world with evangelistic engagement, a crucial model for contemporary believers. We are not called to monastic isolation nor to cultural assimilation, but to be salt and light. Matthew chapter 5 verses 13 to 16, preserving purifying influence while maintaining clear distinction. How are you navigating this balance in your own life? Are you preserving your distinctive identity in Christ while remaining lovingly engaged with those who don't yet know the Savior? The most provocative application of the Genesis chapter 6 narrative for our day may be in the area of transformative technology. The genetic manipulations we carry out in the laboratory today, from gene therapies and genetically modified babies to experiments with human-animal chimeras, raise profound questions about the limits of human intervention in the created order. Advanced artificial intelligence, eventually promising a singularity in which machine consciousness will surpass human, represents another domain where previously inviolable boundaries are being crossed. The transhumanist movement, with its promise to overcome human biological limitations through technology, disturbingly echoes the temptation that ancient texts attribute to the Watchers, to offer humans knowledge and capabilities beyond those divinely assigned to our current stage. As Christians, we are not called to reject technology or scientific advancement, but to approach these tools with discernment, recognizing that not everything that is technically possible is morally permissible or spiritually wise. Jesus' vision that the last days would resemble the days of Noah takes on new urgency in the face of these trends. If pre-Diluvian corruption involved the dilution of the genuine human through supernatural interference, aren't we witnessing contemporary parallels? Not just through literal genetic manipulation, but through the conceptual dissolution of what it means to be human created in the image of God. Contemporary ideologies that deny the God-given nature of man and woman, philosophies that reduce human consciousness to mere biochemical impulses, technologies that promise digital immortality through uploading consciousness, all represent attacks on biblical anthropology as fundamental as the literal genetic corruption of the Nephilim. Jesus warned that, without divine intervention, no one would survive, Matthew chapter 24 verse 22. A warning that takes on new levels of meaning in the age of weapons of mass destruction, genetic engineering, and potentially uncontrolled artificial intelligence. Finally, the narrative of the sons of God reminds us that human history is not a neutral evolutionary process, but a cosmic battlefield. Events in our physical dimension reflect and are influenced by spiritual realities that we cannot see directly. As Paul states in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." The biblical worldview rejects both materialism, which denies any reality beyond the physical, and dualism, which completely separates the spiritual from the material. Instead, it presents an integrated universe where the visible and the invisible are constantly interacting. This perspective invites us to discern the spiritual patterns underlying the social, political, and technological developments of our time. Not to fall into paranoid conspiracy, but to exercise the spiritual discernment that Paul prays all believers will develop, Philippians chapter 1 verses 9 to 10. For just as the sons of God of Genesis chapter 6 operated with a hidden agenda that went beyond simple lust or rebellion, aiming to corrupt the messianic lineage, so the spiritual forces in our own time have strategic objectives that transcend superficial phenomena. We live in an age of dissolving boundaries, between the human and the machine, between the natural and the artificial, between objective truth and subjective construction. The same temptations that ancient texts attribute to the Watchers echo in the promises of modern technology and alternative spirituality. Forbidden knowledge, supernatural power, immortality without redemption. Like Noah in his generation, we are called to resist the current of cultural conformity, preserving true human nature as defined by the Creator, while proclaiming the only genuine hope for transcendence. Not genetic manipulation or technological enhancement, but the spiritual transformation that comes through Jesus Christ. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.